Almost 2 weeks ago, British lawmakers advanced a bill toward full engagement in British society that legalizes euthanasia, or what is often referred to as medically assisted suicide. The culture of death continues to make advances across the globe, particularly in Western industrialized societies. How do we think about this biblically? The British law that was just passed is argued by proponents to have sufficient safeguards to prevent any abuse of the law toward British citizens. The law says that patients would be required to make 2 signed witness declarations expressing their wish to die and to receive evaluations from 2 doctors who verify their eligibility. Opponents of the law argue that even these protections are insufficient to protect the most mentally and emotionally vulnerable members of society. They say that even the bill's safeguards would possibly allow for pressure toward vulnerable members of society to pursue medical suicide, not just in their self-interest, but in the interest of the society at large. The last time I talked about suicide on Truth Currents, a number of months ago, one of the comments that I received was, you should just leave those topics to the experts. Doctors know best. There are experts who specialize in these kinds of topics, and preachers should stay out of it. Well, first of all, truth is truth, whatever source it comes from. So the vocational background of a truth speaker shouldn't play into this conversation at all. But let's talk about that idea that medically assisted suicide is okay as long as we put the right experts into the equation. Let me tell you about expertise. In America, in a little bit of a different direction, we have just seen recently the unfolding of a drama that we weren't aware about as the American people for a decade. In fact, what happened was, in 2015, Johanna Olson Kennedy, a fundraiser for the Center for Trans Youth Health and Development Children's Hospital in Los Angeles, commissioned a study that she thought would prove what she expected to be true, which was that that pharmaceutical assistance for transgender students, what we call gender-affirming care, that medical assistance, puberty blockers and such, would actually help the mental condition of minors suffering from gender dysphoria or other body image issues. What happens is, when the study on children and gender, done in 2015, really a landmark study, when it was completed, the results were actually the opposite of what she expected the study to endorse. Rather than saying children with gender dysphoria are helped by puberty blockers, the research actually came to the very opposite conclusion. In other words, these pharmaceutical contributions to this process actually in double-blind studies proved to do more mental damage and harm than good. Now, that should have been a seminal moment in the debate. It should have been a study that was released, a study that could have been peer-reviewed and duplicated by other think tanks and research agencies. It should have been information that made its way into the public square as we debated gender issues, transgender issues, over the last decade. Instead, Olson Kennedy argued that because this information seemed to contradict the expected result, in order, in her words, that the information would not be weaponized, she shelved the research. That is, she put it on a shelf in a cubicle somewhere and never released it. Puberty blockers did not do what she and her team expected them to do, and rather than allowing government officials, doctors, and the public to draw conclusions for themselves, she believed that the results of the study should be suppressed. So what she said, what she did was she hid credible research that contradicted a political ideology. Now, that revelation is the kind of thing that at some point in our past would have had massive fallout. That's the kind of thing that would have ended her career and caused her to lose her license as a doctor. And yet, in the world that we live in today, despite her confession, I don't expect anything to happen to her. Why? Because of what might be termed the death of expertise. We are told by progressives that we should stay out of these contentious medical issues because we're not experts. We should trust the experts, only to discover that the experts are fudging the research in order to justify positions that cannot be supported by science. How many times are conservatives told, how many times are Christians told, just follow the science. Don't be medieval. Follow the science. The science is on our side. We can't leave it to the experts because the experts are lying in order to protect the empire of financial gain that they have established through this shell game of medical procedures meant to exist under the label of gender-affirming care, which is little more than physical mutilation of minors. A culture that has aborted millions of babies over the course of the last 50 years has simply advanced our culture of death to now mutilate our children after they're born. There is a spiritual enemy behind this, and he hates human beings created in the image of God. Well, that's the transgender issue. How do we come back around to this assisted suicide issue? Well, assisted suicide is often sold to us as a strictly controlled practice with very strict criteria intended only for terminally ill and grievously suffering patients. The problem is, Great Britain is late to the party because Australia and especially Canada have had this for some time. The Scandinavian countries have had this, and what we have seen, like night follows day, an inevitable evolution of this policy is that what starts as a practice designed for a tiny minority inevitably begins to broaden until it becomes a blank check for anyone tired of living or deemed unworthy of life. Canada is a perfect example, since medical assistance in dying, what they call MAID, M-A-I-D, the MAID law, since it was put into place, deaths have grown 13-fold in just 6 years of legalization. In other words, today, 4%, 1 out of every 25 deaths in Canada is a death imposed by a medical professional who legally executes a Canadian citizen. How did we get here? Well, we decided that we could make and create life through all kinds of medical technologies, and it created in us the illusion that life was ours to do with as we see fit. We have made choice a self-justifying idol. One British proponent of the new law said, life is precious, but so is choice. Well, that's an interesting statement because in my experience, anybody who makes that argument will always, by the end of the argument, choose choice over life as the supreme value. Technology has conditioned us to look for the easy way out, and frankly, the worst part of this is The only thing that makes death possible, it makes it bearable, is that people used to die surrounded by friends and family. We've tried to sanitize death, and so most people today now die in hospitals or in hospice centers. Often they are left to themselves with no family around, maybe a nurse, maybe a doctor present, but that's about all. With that attitude towards death, more and more people die alone, and more people, frankly, live alone. A common theme in those who seek medically assisted suicide is that they are excessively lonely and isolated. Well, it's interesting. We're told that the Bible doesn't have much to say about this issue, but in fact, that's not true. The Bible speaks about euthanasia in a couple of very distinct places. One is in 1 Samuel chapter 31. In 1 Samuel 31, we have the death of King Saul, who was wounded in battle and severely injured. He asked his armor bearer to kill him to relieve him of his pain. 1 Samuel 31:4 says, "Then Saul said to his armor bearer, 'Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and mistreat me.' But his armor bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it." Now it's interesting that the armor bearer of the king refused to comply with the king's request that he be killed because of his pain. But it tells us in 2 Samuel that the king didn't just fall on his own sword, but that he was abetted in that suicide by a different man who boasted in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 9, that Saul said, "Stand here by me and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive." And this man accommodated that request. He actually helped kill the king. When he reported his act, I think expecting commendation, when he reported that act to David, who would be the next king, David in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 14 through 16, instructs that this man be executed for his actions. He touched the Lord's anointed, as David put it. The clear message from those two accounts is that we should not comply with requests to assist suicide, even when someone is in severe pain, even in a warfare situation, or even when the person is in a position of authority to order us to do so. What we see here is that the presence of consent does not change the morality of the act. It is murder, whether it is requested or not. Well, the second story is the death of Abimelech, when a woman threw a millstone on his head, crushing his skull. In Judges chapter 9, verse 54, it says, "Then he called quickly to the young man, his armor bearer, and said to him, 'Draw your sword and kill me, lest they say of me, a woman killed him.' And his young man thrust him through, and he died." Now in this story, Abimelech's actions and character are not endorsed. You can read the entire chapter and see the story. His actions are actually criticized. In the flow of the narrative, his death at the hands of his armor bearer is understood to be the contemptible end of an evil character. His request for euthanasia is just the climax of a life of wickedness, and his request is not endorsed by Scripture. Now, here's the trick that is played on this topic. Assisted suicide is presented as the most compassionate option for people who are suffering. It was designed originally to speak about physical suffering, but it has been expanded to include anybody that has emotional or mental suffering. In other words, if you're lonely and you aren't happy with your life, you can ask to die. Now, the Bible is not against a desire to move from the pain of this life into the joy of the next life, especially for those who know Jesus. In Philippians 1:23, Paul says, "My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is better." In other words, he's yearning for the day when his suffering in this world is over. But there is no suggestion that the ending of pain and suffering is ever to be done by initiating the process of death. There is no justification scripturally for suicide. What a biblical perspective of death does mean is that we should not attempt to preserve life at all costs. There's a balance here between not acting to hasten death and not using extraordinary means to extend life. In other words, medical technology, which is highly expensive and intrusive, can be used to extend life. But a biblical perspective does not require that and would allow patients to die naturally. That does not, however, justify the withdrawal of food or water in order to hasten death, but it does mean that patients are not required to accept every medical intervention that is offered. The Bible clearly endorses pain relief for people who are close to death. Proverbs 31:6 says, "Give strong drink to the one who is perishing and wine to those in bitter distress." That is okay. But it's fascinating to me that the surge in this impulse to kill people who are living in pain comes at the very moment in history when we have more pharmaceutical and medical options to relieve end-of-life suffering than we've ever had before. Isn't it interesting that 100 years ago, people didn't have access to morphine or other kinds of drugs to ease their passing, and yet there was no push in the Western civilization of those generations to move toward suicide? Why the shift now? Because there is an enemy. He hates human beings created in the image of God, and he promotes death everywhere he goes. Many of the elderly and sick in our society perceive that they are a burden to their family, and they want to remove that burden. Frankly, folks, that is a shame on our Western culture that people are meant to feel that way towards their own family. The Bible is very clear. Family is responsible for nurturing and protecting and honoring those who are coming to the ends of their life. We can provide every assistance possible to ease the passing, but we step over a dangerous line when we make it legal and eventually societally not just permissible, but we push people to the direction that they should kill themselves, and we'll even help them to do it because they're a burden on their families and on their society. Opening the door to euthanasia in the United Kingdom sends the message that elderly people or those with long-term health struggles have lives that are not worth living. It incentivizes giving up on people early rather than focusing on improving their lives by including them in families and in society. In the same way that we as Christians should protect unborn life, we should protect life at its end. They say, well, I should be allowed to die with dignity. Listen, Jack Kevorkian, who started this movement, he used to hook people up to a machine in the backseat of a Volkswagen Beetle. Dying there is hardly what I would call a dignified death. Dying with dignity means dying in the hands of the Lord at the time that He is established, submitting to the sovereignty of the one who created us and numbered our days. Do not fall victim to the false argument that it is compassionate to take vulnerable, lonely people and tell them that it's in their best interest to die and get out of the way. It's the Christmas season. You might as well institutionalize old Ebenezer Scrooge and hold the attitude that they should go ahead and die and decrease the surplus population. When Scrooge says it, we recoil in horror. But when we frame it in terms of compassion, we fall victim to a logically nonsensical, unbiblical position. Life at its beginning and life at its end is sacred. Let's not forget that. This is Truth Currents.